Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Jander for Card Runners, and I'm here with Out of Position Flop Play Part 2, Understanding Lines. We're going to start off right where we finished from the last video, so first we're going to start with an outline for this video. So I want to explain what factors determine whether or not the opponent will bet marginal hands in position. That's obviously incredibly important for determining his betting frequency. So this relies heavily on his EV when he bets any two cards as well as the board texture. I'm also going to analyze the effects of betting, check calling, and check raising out of position. I've talked about that a little bit in other videos, but we're going to go into a bit more detail. We're going to pay special attention on how this affects the EV of the opponent's bluffs on the flop. And then we're going to start solving hands, which we're probably not going to get to at this video, but it will at least set us up to start by next video. So I will present ratios, frequencies as they are needed. We have enough information to get started once we've reached this point. So I'm not going to go over all the frequencies we need for betting and check raising and that stuff. It's in other videos. I'll mention it as it's needed when we start solving the hands, which will happen either at the end of this video or the beginning of next video. When should we bet our entire range in position? Perhaps the hardest common question we ask ourselves when in position on the flop is, how do I determine whether or not I should bet or check this marginal hand? For example, assume we open at 9 of hearts, 8 of hearts, and the cutoff, and the button calls, and the flop comes Queen of clubs, 8 of spades, and 4 of hearts. Is this a bet or not? Imagine you are coaching someone who is worse than you at poker, and they ask you whether or not you think in theory this is a continuation bet. So pause for a moment, and it doesn't matter how good you are at poker. What would you tell someone if they asked whether or not this is a bet or a check in theory when they're in position? I realize it is opponent dependent since it is very close and both checking and betting have very different effects, but there is a theoretically correct answer here even if it is hard to find. So one thing that I've learned a lot is when you try to teach someone something and if you can't teach it well, it means you don't really understand the concept. So if you're not able to explain why you think this is a bet or a check very well right now, it probably means you're leaking pretty bad here. If you are able to explain it pretty well, then you probably have some idea what you're doing, and we'll go into more detail and we'll see whether or not we're on the same page. What determines whether or not you bet here? Determining factor number 1, the EV of betting any two cards. We stressed this incredibly important concept throughout the last video. If we can bet any two cards here for +3 big blinds, since the opponent check folds so much, we're going to be much more likely to bet than check here. In other words, we're more likely to cash in the hand now, the greater the EV of betting is. It's harder for checking to be more plus EV than betting if betting is plus 3.5 BB than if it is plus 1.7 BB. So keep that in mind. That is the most important thing, which is why I stressed it like nuts in the last video. If your opponent is check folding a ton, you're probably going to be very unlikely to check back since betting is so profitable. And you're always comparing the EV of checking to betting. So if your opponent check folds like crazy, you're going to bet like nuts. Determining factor number 2, the risk of allowing the opponent to see a turn card with his entire checking range. We did not stress this much in the last video, but it is incredibly important. Hands where giving a free card is riskier will have a lower EV when they check than hands which don't fear giving a free card. Since we only have a pair of 8s here, about half the turn cards will be overcards. If we had Jack-Jack, giving a free card would be less risky since there are fewer overcards which can turn. So there are more factors in this, but these are, in my opinion, the two main factors which are really going to determine whether or not the player in position is betting a lot of sort of marginal hands. And you're going to find when you are starting to try to solve hands or when you're working with whatever program you're working with, that usually there'll be a lot of hands that are around the same strength. You know, there'll be a lot of middle pairs, pocket pairs that are between middle pair and top pair. And if your opponent is check folding a ton and you're in position, you're going to bet like crazy. Likewise, if you're check folding a ton as the pre-flop raiser, if once you check, it means you're pretty much check folding, your opponent's going to bet like crazy and you can't be at an equilibrium. So you not only care about how much you're check folding, but you also care about how risky is seeing a free card, which I'm going to explain why right now. So first we got to go back to the basics. Then we'll get into more complex examples. So don't let the theory confuse you. All we're trying to answer here is betting more plus EV than checking? The following statements are usually true and good guidelines. In reality, there are more variables to take into account. If checking that this specific hand is risky since a free card will likely outdraw us, then the EV of checking is less than if we had a hand less likely to be outdrawn. This makes us more likely to bet this vulnerable hand. So that's easy enough. If I have a hand that's vulnerable, I'm going to be more likely to bet it because I'm saying, well, yeah, I might not be in love with betting this vulnerable hand because I can get check raised, and I don't know if I do very well when my opponent check calls, but I don't want to check back and just give away tons of free, cards for my opponent to outdraw me. Simple enough. On boards where giving a free card is very risky, we expect our opponent to more aggressively bet in position since the EV of checking will be lower since he'll likely get outdrawn by our checking range. So if it's a board texture where I know my opponent is going to really hate giving me free cards just because there's a lot of risky stuff that can come on the turn, I think he's going to be more likely to bet the earlier streets, whereas if the board's very, very, dry or sort of locked where it's not likely we're going to outdraw him, I think he's going to be more likely to check back marginal hands. Think about these for a moment. They aren't hard rules, but very important. We'll go over some examples. You probably don't need to think about this, but if you want to, pause right there. Examples for continuation betting in position. Imagine, for example, we are check folding 60% of the time once we check. This means it is plus 2.4 BB EV for the opponent to bet any 2 cards for 6 big blinds into an 8 big blind pot, and more plus EV the better hand is. So, the better his hand is, the more plus EV his bet's obviously going to be because he has some chance to outdraw the check calling range. But even if we were betting any 2 cards in position, if our opponent was check folding 60% of the time, the EV would be plus 2.4 BB, even if our cards were complete blanks. Which boards seem more likely for the opponent to want to bet any 2 cards if we are check folding that often? So, one thing that's very important to do when we're talking about out of position flop play is we have to imagine both sort of being out of position and in position when we're trying to, take a theoretical approach. Because we're trying to find an equilibrium. So if we think, both the person out of position and in position are relatively indifferent, neither player really has an incentive to change, right? A Nash equilibrium. That's how we know we've kind of solved the hand or gotten as close as we can. So we're going to have to go back and forth from imagining ourselves both in position and out of position. So when you are in position, which of these 3 board textures are you going to be most likely to check back even though your opponent's going to be check folding like crazy? So is it going to be behind door number 1, King of Clubs, 7 of Spades, 2 of Hearts, door number 2, 6 of Diamonds, 8 of Clubs, 6 of Spades, door number 3, 10 of Spades, 9 of Spades, 7 of Clubs? Which board textures would you check back if your opponent's check folding 60% of the time? And likewise, when we're out of position, which boards do we think our opponent will check back when we're check folding 60% of the time? Should be pretty much the same answer. So, pause and think for a moment. If your opponent is check calling 30% and check raising 10% for defending 40% total, and that is more defended checks than most people defend as the pre-flop raiser, though not necessarily always the cold caller, what does your check back range look like on all of these boards? Your position matters little in these examples, but assume you're in the cutoff and the big blind check the flop if it tickles your fancy. So, it doesn't really matter what position you imagine, it's going to prove my point either way. So if you want to pretend you're in the button against the cutoff, or if you want to pretend you're in the cutoff against the big blind, either way when you're in position, which of these boards would you have a check back range? Really think about this, because it's very useful to notice you have a leak now, rather than just hear what I say in a minute, because if you notice you have a leak now, you'll think, oh, well, if I have that leak, a lot of other people probably do too, and I can exploit it. So just pause for a moment and think about these board textures. So here is my personal analysis. This is theory-driven, but it's definitely not something you can theoretically prove, so it's not something, like a rule or a ratio or anything. King 7-2 Rainbow. I'll check back here pretty often. I'm not afraid of giving free cards with King X, Queens, and Jacks. And when I say King X, I mean a king with a weak kicker. And don't really see what betting accomplishes, since I only get 2 streets of value anyways if I have, like, a King X, Queens, or Jacks hand. Even 2 streets might be a little bit optimistic. In other words, I think checking with Queens is more plus EV than around 2.4 BB. So I know betting is 2.4 BB, so if I'm checking back these hands, I'm obviously saying I think checking back is more than 2.4 BB in EV. So cool. So I'm checking back here quite a lot, even if my opponent check folds a lot, because I have a lot of, King X suited in my range that I don't want to bet. Cool enough. Now let's go to 6-8-6 Rainbow. If my opponent isn't check raising aggressively here, I'd rather bet hands like 7s, 8x, 9s, and 10s for value now and not give out free cards. Maybe I'll only be able to bet 1 street for value and have a bluff catcher on the river, but such is life. Hands like Ace King and Ace Queen also work well as bluffs despite losing showdown value if they bet, so I'll probably bet any 2 cards here. In other words, this is a board where all the hands I have that kind of want to get to showdown and or want to see free cards, so like Ace Queen and Ace King both do well at showdown and are fine with seeing additional cards, they're also pretty vulnerable. The opponent can have a lot of, under cards like Jack 10 suited, King Jack suited when I have Ace Queen, so I don't really want to give away a ton of free cards there. The most obvious example is when I have middle pairs, 8x, 7s, and 9s. It's going to be hard to get 2 streets of value with pocket 7s here. It might not even be possible if I make a normal size bet. So that means I want to get to showdown with 7s because I probably have the best hand, but wait a second, there's 2 cards to come. 7s are incredibly vulnerable. So if my opponent's offering me, hey Matt, if you bet right now, I'll give you at least, 2.4 BB, I'm probably going to be like, yeah, I'll take that with 7s. I don't really want to give out 2 free cards. I'm just going to bet 7s right now, even though I know I'm probably going to have to check back the turn a lot of the time and maybe deal with a river bet because you're allowing me to make such a profitable bet now. So not only am I getting some value from weaker hands, but I'm also making my opponent fold a lot of hands that I'm vulnerable to. 10 of spades, 9 of spades, 7 of clubs. No way I check anything back here if betting is plus 2.4 BB and EV. Before I even read the next part, just look at this board. If I can make a very profitable bet, what hands do I feel comfortable with checking back where I don't feel like, I'd rather just take the money now? Checking back anything here is super risky, and I'd rather make a very plus EV bet and deal with the check raise if it happens. Once again, the hands that want to get to showdown here. So usually we're very, set. The hands that want to get to showdown, those are the hands that don't bet because we want to keep our opponent's range wide and we want to get to showdown and win our small pot without getting check raised. But those hands here that want to do that are very, very vulnerable. Those are 10x and 9x, and they hate giving free cards. So I'm pretty much going to bet them. There's no way I can check back a hand like ace-9 here and feel good about the turn. So even if I bet ace-9 on the flop, if I make my opponent fold a hand like king-queen on the flop, which I might not even be able to do anyways, I feel pretty good about it. If I make my opponent fold ace-queen on the flop, I feel pretty good about it because my hand is so vulnerable to ace-queen when I have a hand like king-10. So the very, very, dry locked board on the top. I'm going to pretty much check back a ton here. 6-8-6, the next board that's kind of in the middle, I'm probably going to still bet almost everything there. And then the 10-9-7, which is, the very wet board that hates giving free cards with anything, I'm going to bet my entire range. Wrapping it up. Just because the opponent can make a plus EV bet with any 2 cards in position does not imply he will bet his entire range on the flop. Whether or not the opponent will bet any 2 cards is going to depend largely on how risky giving our range a free card is. It is possible our opponent will check back many hands even if betting any 2 cards is very plus EV. This is important to note since it may result in our check raise failing even if we're mostly check folding. So, our opponent on some board textures is going to check back a lot because he does not mind giving us a free card with our entire range. So even if we're check folding the vast majority of the time, sometimes the opponent's going to check back if it's the right board texture for that. That's important to understand because if we're trying to check raise these boards, our check raise might fail when we don't expect it to. So this is something that you really want to make sure you fully understand because a lot of times we saw if our opponent can bet any 2 cards profitably, it means something's got to be completely wrong. We're getting exploited. Like if we're opening the button and our opponent can 3-bet any 2 cards in the big blind profitably, we're clearly doing something theoretically wrong. Here, when we check out of position on the flop, there's already a ton of dead money in the pot. So when we check to our opponent, every line he takes is of course pretty much going to be profitable. Checking is going to be very profitable because then he's getting to see a turn in a pot where there's a bunch of dead money. Betting, of course, should be profitable as well. Understanding the board texture and, how profitable his bet should be to, to sort of trigger him betting any 2 cards is going to be very important when we're trying to sort of find equilibrium as for it looks like both the player out of position and the player in position has no incentive to change. If our opponent has an incentive to bet any 2 cards on the flop, we should probably not have a donking range since we'll just check raise all our strong hands. And I shouldn't say just check raise. We'll check raise or check call. So since we'll check raise or check call and, all of our strong hands, we should not have a donking range because, if we had a really strong hand, we would just check and let our opponent bet. So then there's effectively sort of more dead money in the pot when we do decide to get aggressive with a check raise. Or if our range is very weak and vulnerable, we might want to check call and delay the check raise to a later street. So it is important to think about whether or not your opponent should bet any 2 cards because if he should, you should not be donk betting. Deciding whether or not we should bet the flop out of position. So now we're going to do what we just did for in position, only we're going to do out of position. So it's of course going to be tougher. Let's go back to playing out of position. The same concept we just talked about in position applies out of position, but it's more complicated. After this, we'll know enough to go on to solving hands and learn more by example. So a lot of people probably want to get there right now. To be honest, I kind of do too, but we need to get this stuff out of the way first. We've already discussed the first thing to look at when deciding whether or not to bet the flop is if we're defending enough checks. Okay. If we aren't, we likely need to check call or check raise since our range is weak. Yup. We're now ready to look at the effects of a flop bet to determine whether betting, check calling, or check raising is more plus EV out of position. So, in theory, we always have to be taking the most plus EV line with our hand. We are never taking a negative EV line or a less plus EV line with our hand. In theory, if both players are balanced, everyone's taking the most plus EV line with their hand at every single point, and no one has an incentive to change. A lot of people get that mixed up and think you need to put, hands in one range to make other hands profitable. That does not exist. We're always taking the most plus EV line. So now we're just going to figure out, by looking at specific hands, how do we determine what line is the most effective one? So now we're going to start off with analyzing the effects of betting out of position on the flop, which is going to be the most complex one we talk about right now. When we bet on the flop, we will usually be betting a polarized range, more on this later, so the majority of the time our opponent will call or fold. Betting 75% of the pot usually has the following effects. It allows the opponent to fold around 40% of his flopping range. This makes his range on the turn much stronger than checking with it. Check calling makes him see the turn with 100% of his range, whether he bets or checks, every hand sees the turn. It makes the pot bigger since the pot is now guaranteed to be 2.5 pot size bets on the turn, or bigger, if our opponent raises, but at least 2.5 pot size bets. It makes us lose more money when we're made indifferent. So if we check and our opponent bets and our hand is a 0 EV bluff catcher, we lose less because we've invested less money in the pot. If we bet and get raised and our hand is a bluff catcher, then we now have lost more money because we've invested more money in the pot. Remember, if a balanced player is raising a c-bet in position on a 7 of clubs, king of clubs, 6 of spades board, his range is likely sets, draws, and air. If we aren't continuation betting like a monkey, ace-king will rarely be more plus EV for the opponent to raise than call. The opponent's raise makes many hands in our betting range close to 0 EV calls, but we've now invested more. So if you've seen my other videos, you know that mathematically, even if you're only raising on this flop texture, maybe pocket 7s, pocket 6s, and 7-6 suited, that's 8 combos, and you raise a few, like 3 or 4 really good flush draws or combo draws, you're allowed to bluff like 15 combos. So you might think like, oh, well, king 7-6 board, my opponent can't raise all that much and make me indifferent. He only has 6 sets and 2 pair. No, he can raise a ton. So if you're playing against someone good, you're going to get raised still a decent amount here, and then you're going to be made indifferent. So a lot of people kind of want to recklessly bet out of position because they think, oh, well, I don't want to check call or check because if I check and my opponent bets, I'm indifferent to calling and that sucks. That's fine if your opponent's not very good, but if you're playing against someone really good, even when you bet a lot of the time, you're going to get raised, and now you're going to be in that same crappy indifferent spot, only you've invested a lot more money in the pot. So just be very aware of that. What hands should value bet on the flop? There are 2 main things I look for in a hand when value betting the flop. This seems really simple, but is very easy to forget and will become very important later on when deciding how to defend our checks. So I'm very big on learning in general that repetition is extremely useful, and you can know stuff, but it's easy to forget it when you're playing against people and you're trying to exploit them. This is probably one of the 2 things I repeat all the time, even though it's very simple. The first, just for a random fact, is small bets get the opponent to call very often with a weak range, whereas big bets make the opponent call not very often with a strong range. We're going to talk about that a lot when I make a more in-depth bet sizing series, but that's something that's very important to keep in mind. And it's just something that's easy to forget when you go around just kind of automatically betting like everyone else does. But fundamentally, small bets make people call wide with weak hands. Big bets make them call not very often with strong hands. Here is the flop betting one that I repeat all the time. So what can value betting the flop do? Number 1, it gets value from worse hands which otherwise might not bet. So that's the first most obvious thing it does. It gets us value. Number 2 is it makes hands which have the potential to outdraw us with free cards fold. Those are 2 very significant accomplishments on the flop. They're both a big deal. One is getting value from worse hands. Everyone kind of knows that. That's obvious. Whereas making hands which have the potential to outdraw us with free cards fold isn't one people talk about very much. It's one of those rules or concepts, I should say, where fish kind of put way too much emphasis in it. Like, oh man, I have to bet because I don't want to get outdrawn. One time someone drew out on me on the river and it sucked. So there's kind of like that sort of assumption that goes with when people say like, oh, well, I want to bet to make my opponent fold crap. it's like, oh, you're just a nit. That's not necessarily true. And likewise, you'll also hear really good players sometimes say something like, well, what's the point in betting if it doesn't, don't value bet if you can't get called from worse? What's the point in betting if you don't make, better hands fold or worse hands call? No, there can still be a point in betting even if you don't get calls from worse hands or folds from better hands. We'll talk about that as we go on. Okay, so making hands which can outdraw us fold. This concept probably confused me longer than any theoretical concept, but my thoughts on it now are probably a bit different than in the donk betting video. Hopefully they're a lot better and clearer. Because of this, I'll illustrate this difficult concept with an example. Suppose we open under the gun with pocket jacks and the button calls. The flop comes 10, 6, 4, rainbow. What should we do with jacks here? I know that's a lot of typing, but if you want to just search out, the title is Basic Spot I Cannot Figure Out for the Life of Me. It's a hand history I posted a while ago on Card Runners. There's some good discussion about this here, and this was a spot I was really thinking about not too long ago. Alright, so should we bet or check jacks on that 10, 6, 4 flop? Advantages of betting. So let's first go over these. We can get more value from weaker hands which would otherwise check back and try to showdown. 10x, 9s, ace, king, etc. We can often get a street of value from them, or maybe even 2 streets of value, and then, they check down and we still win the hand, whereas if we check, they're going to check down and we're not going to get as much value. We can also make the opponent fold high equity hands. Opponent has to fold hands like queen, king, and ace, queen, since he doesn't know if his outs are clean. So even though queen, king, and ace, queen have 6, maybe even 7 outs if you count the backdoor flush draw against our bet here, and keep in mind, if our opponent knew he had 6 or 7 outs against our marginal hand in position, there's almost no way he'd fold. That's very, very close to an open-ended straight draw. He has way enough implied odds to call, and not to mention he can, bluff us off on some cards as well. But he doesn't know that. Here, when we're betting the flop on a 10-6-4 board and we're under the gun, he's going to think, I don't really want to call with queen-king. I often don't want to even call with ace-queen, because even if I do hit, I don't know if I'm going to get all that much value, and I could hit, and then Matt has an overpair, or he has me out-kicked, so I'm just going to fold now. That's very, very good when we have pocket jacks, because we aren't, we're very vulnerable to those hands. So due to the nature of our range, we can make them fold high equity hands that we wouldn't usually be able to get someone to fold. We can't usually make people fold 25 or 30% equity hands on the flop. Here we can. The other thing that's very important to keep in mind is when we are betting here and getting value from 10x, 9s, and ace king, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but we're likely not going to get bluffed off those hands because those are also hands that our opponent will want to show down. So when our opponent does call our flop or turn bet with 10x, he's not likely going to, make us fold jacks on the river. The problems with betting, and there are many. We are unable to get 3 streets of value going bet, bet, bet for normal sized bets. So we'll talk about not normal sized bets in another video, but going bet, bet, bet when we're out of position is something we usually want to do. Very, very hard, if not just straight out impossible to do it here, because our opponent's range is so strong. We have to check the river and give our opponent the chance to randomize with value bets and bluffs. So being in position is awesome, especially in a spot like this, because I can just go bet, bet, check, and every single time my opponent got to see an additional card, he had to pay for it. And then on the river, when my hand's not all that strong, I can't get any more value, but there's no more card to come, I just check back and the hand ends. I don't have that luxury because I'm out of position, so life is tough. We also make the opponent's range stronger. He's now getting to the turn with hands that are overall stronger than if we check, yet keep in mind, a lot of the hands he's calling our flop bet with like 10x and 9s, we're not as vulnerable to as a hand like ace-queen or king-queen, which we make fold. So we have a lot of really good things going on in that regard. And the opponent can raise us with a balanced range on the turn or bet the river after we check and make us indifferent for a large pot. That sucks. So it really sucks being made indifferent, but it sucks a whole lot more if you're made indifferent after betting flop, betting turn, and getting raised than if, you just check the flop and we're made indifferent there. And we probably wouldn't be made indifferent if we check this flop with jacks because it's such a strong hand, but you get the idea. If we're made indifferent for a very large pot, we've lost a lot more money than if we're made indifferent for a small pot. So a lot of things going on with betting and checking, and this is why it's so incredibly hard to know what to do out of position on the flop. There's no formula that's just going to tell you whether or not jacks are a bet here. So you have to just really think about all the theoretical concepts, a lot of the exploitative concepts you know from practice when you're playing at the tables, and then try to make what you think looks like the best decision, because it's not a spot where we get as pretty of a formula as we do when we're on the river or when we're dealing with more polarized ranges. Once again, we're very far from a polarized range here, and we're very far from the river, which means our hand's not going to model as well as it would in other situations, so we have to just apply more theoretical concepts to try to find what looks like an equilibrium. My thoughts on playing jacks on the 10-6-4 rainbow board out of position. So this is pretty much my thought process, or what I say to myself. Well, there is no way to play this hand in a way that I really feel good about it. Yet making the opponent fold hands I beat on the flop and turn accomplishes a lot here, as jacks is so vulnerable to those hands that I beat. And if I do bet the flop and turn and check the river, he'll probably call 10x or 9 twice, then check the river. That's a lot different than if he's calling me twice with a flush draw. Because if my opponent calls the flop bet with a flush draw, he might be able to bluff me, raise me on the turn and make me fold, or he might be able to bluff me off it or make me indifferent on the river. So that's a lot different when he has a marginal hand here that I do very well against. And then my other thought is, even though I'm not happy about betting twice to make the pot bigger and the opponent's range stronger, I don't see a better option here. He can only bet so much, and when he does bet, I'll deal with it. Another thing that's very easy to forget when you're doing theory is, even if your opponent can make you indifferent when he bets with a balanced range, he's only going to be able to make you indifferent so often, otherwise you can exploit him. Talk about that again in a minute. While I still hate betting the flop for value out of position, if we can't bet all 3 streets on most turn and rivers, sometimes it is justified. So I still hate betting the flop and turn with the intention of checking the river out of position. I just feel like I understand it better now, and because I do understand it better, I don't hate the line as much as I used to, though I still strongly dislike it. Sometimes it just can't be avoided. I believe I underrated the value of folding worse hands in previous videos. Being out of position sucks. Defending checks out of position is hard. When you first really start looking at your out of position game, you'll likely think, wow, I'm check folding way too much once I check, I suck. This can't be right, but how do I fix it? It's very, very hard to fix this, and there's not usually a lot of helpful material to help you fix this. So it's a really big problem, and I didn't know exactly what to do with it when I first encountered it. In an effort to learn how to defend more checks, I probably tried to defend marginal hands by check calling, which should have been bets. We're of course usually going to check call with a lot of our marginal hands, because we don't want to make the pot bigger, and we need to defend some checks. But I probably overrated this concept of check calling with a marginal hand, because I didn't realize, you know what, sometimes there's just a hand where betting makes the opponent fold too many high equity hands against our hand. Because remember, we have to take the most plus EV line with our hand at every single point. So we're not really caring when we have a specific hand what our opponent's overall equity against our range is. That will determine whether or not the opponent calls or folds. But what we especially can care about is how much equity does our opponent have against our one hand that we have right now. So with the pocket jacks example, the whole reason why we're making ace, queen, and king, queen fold is because that hand does not have much equity against our range. But what I care about when I'm holding jacks is the fact that, hey, when I bet that, I make my opponent's hand fold, and I made my opponent fold high equity hands against this specific hand I have right now. The opponent can only bet and make us indifferent at a certain frequency. For example, if we have jacks as under the gun and bet the flop and turn on a 10 of hearts, 6 of clubs, 4 of spades flop, and 8 of hearts turn, the opponent cannot bet his entire range on the 2 of spade river. So if we check to our opponent here, we likely should more or less be very, very close to indifferent to check calling or check folding. The removal effects will matter a little bit, but for the most part, we should be very close to indifferent. The key thing is, we can still check raise the river with sets and bluffs, which is going to make the opponent not want to bet super, super recklessly. We block some of the jack-jack hands in his range, so on the river he is usually only betting queens and sets for value. And a lot of those hands would have raised on the turn. A lot of the sets already would have on that board texture. The majority would have, to be honest. So if we do check jacks here, because we cannot get value for betting, we can run the math for it and see if we go bet here, maybe our opponent only has to call the river with pocket jacks and pocket queens. Well, that doesn't do much, because we're never winning then. So we check there because we're never getting called by worse, yet our opponent still can't bet and make us indifferent very often once we have checked. If we check here and our opponent always bets, then we go, whoa, he's betting way too much, our check call is going to be super profitable, and we snap call. If once we check here our opponent's only betting 20% of the time, then we're like, okay, he's going to have enough queens and sets here that we don't want to mess with that, so we have to check fold. There will be some theoretical frequency where once we check on this river, maybe the opponent's able to bet half of the time, So when we bet jacks, we're saying to ourselves, okay, please check back. Or sorry, when we get to the river with jacks and we check, we're saying to ourselves, okay, please check back, please check back. Because if you check back, you're going to have 10x or 9s most likely, and then I win, and I ship the monies, then I go to McDonald's or wherever else I spend it, depending on the stakes I'm playing. So please check back, please check back, please check back. And then once our opponent does check, we're pretty much going to win. If he bets, now we're indifferent, that sucks, but it happens at a certain frequency, and what frequency our opponent is allowed to actually bet and still make us indifferent is going to depend on how many value hands he has, and he doesn't have all that many here. So keep that in mind. Don't be afraid of the bet that he can't even make all that often. Okay, so now we come to the perfect flop value betting hands. So I'm going to go over the perfect flop value betting hands, then check calling, and then check raising. And this is going to be very key when we're trying to solve hands, because we want to just start off doing, the easy hands first, and then based on what our range needs, we can kind of, connect the dots with everything else. So the perfect flop value betting hands. So the bet and it's not close hands on the flop will usually have the following properties. Be able to get value from betting all 3 streets on most turn and river cards. So we already discussed how sometimes we're going to have to bet hands that can't get value betting all 3 streets, but those usually aren't going to be like the perfect obvious hands to bet. We're going to have to really look at those and really think. Those are tougher. We want our hands to be vulnerable to giving free cards, because then when we bet, we don't give a bunch of free cards. We can make our opponent fold hands that have a lot of equity against us. We want to bet hands not strong enough to check raise, since check raising makes the opponent's faulting range way stronger than betting all 3 streets. More on this later. We want it to occur on a board texture where a betting range makes sense for us. So sometimes we'll have a hand where it's like, oh, I'd like to bet this out of position. Maybe I have pocket 10s when I'm in the big blind, on a 6-4-2 flop. I usually like to bet that hand when I'm out of position. But if I flatted there in the big blind against a cutoff open, I probably can't have a donking range there. So in order to bet the obvious hands, the kind of strong, vulnerable hands, the bet has to make sense with our overall entire range. Otherwise, we likely shouldn't be betting anything there. Examples: queens on a 10-5-3 rainbow board, ace-jack on a jack-5-3 rainbow board, jacks on a 7-4-4 two-tone board. All these hands don't really want to give a ton of free cards, and they can get value by betting all 3 streets. For the most part, maybe if you're under the gun versus middle position, you can't bet all 3 streets with ace-jack on the jack-5-3 or queens on the 10-5-3. So, apply a little bit of thinking, but for the most part, you can bet all 3 sheets. These are the kind of the obvious hands. You get the idea. The easiest bets are hands which are not strong enough to check raise and don't want to get free cards, yet can still get value from betting. Value betting with the intention of getting less than 3 streets out of position. So we'll briefly go over this, because this is going to be the hard stuff when we do hands. In general, if giving a free card isn't risky, be more reluctant to bet the flop with a hand that can't get 3 streets of value and use it to protect your checks. King diamonds, 9 of diamonds in the cutoff versus button situation on a king of spades, 7 of hearts, 2 of spades board. This is a super, super obvious check call. A lot of people bet this when betting's probably terrible. Note, don't think, what about flush draws when you see a flop like this? Is betting going to make the flush draw go away? What are you doing on the turn and river after you bet this hand on pretty much every single turn and river? So, when I was saying, okay, I was wrong, I think we should be betting jacks on the flop, even though we can't get 3 streets of value on the 10-6-4 board, the hands that jacks were especially vulnerable to, ace, queen, and queen, king, when we bet, we made them go away. We denied our opponent from being able to realize his equity against our hand, because those hands had crap equity against our range. So when we bet, we knew we made them fold. Here, flush draws do not have crap equity against our range. They're pretty much awesome. So when we bet here, we're not making our opponent fold. All we're doing is bloating the pot, making the opponent's range stronger, giving them the chance to raise, which will make us indifferent after we've invested more money in the pot, and denying a free card does not really do anything, because every turn card we're vulnerable against, other than the ace, isn't going to fold anyways. I mean, the hands that can hit those cards aren't going to fold anyways. So you're likely just bloating the pot to fold later to the flush draw if you are actually against the flush draw here. So check call this hand. It can often be very hard to tell if a hand should be value bet now or used to check call. So an example. What are we doing in the cutoff versus button spot with jack of spades, 10 of spades on a 10 of clubs, 10 of clubs, 5 of clubs, 3 of hearts flop? There are clear advantages and disadvantages for both checking and betting. Excuse me. So if you had a student here that was asking you, like, okay, well, what do you do here, cutoff versus button on a 10 high flop with jack 10? It's going to be tough to answer that, because there's some really bad things about betting Yet when you check and give your opponent a free card, that really sucks. And if you bet now, you maybe can make a higher, a high equity hand fold. That, maybe if you bet now, you make, for example, king queen fold, and then that hand has a lot of equity against you. And then he also might call with under pairs that check down. There's a lot of good and bad things about betting and checking. It's very hard to know exactly what to do here. We'll approach these hands, when we try to solve hands, but for the most part, I'm not going to be able to give you an answer for these. There's just too much going on, and we cannot solve it. The effects of check calling. Check calling allows the opponent to see the turn with 100% of his range for a small or medium-sized pot, depending on whether he bets or checks. The opponent now has the polarized range while we represent a primarily medium-strength range. Actually, I want to pause and talk about that for a second. This is the main reason why people are afraid to check call. It's easy to play polarized ranges. It's hard to play mostly medium-strength ranges. In theory, it should happen all the time. I've heard tons of people say, well, if you ever find a spot really hard, it means you probably misplayed. It doesn't. If you're playing theoretically well, you're going to have a bluff catcher or be lost all the time. So when we check call with a medium strength range, we're going to end up calling down with the worst hand or folding the best hand decently often. There's no real way to get around it. So just because this is an effect of check calling doesn't mean it's, bad and avoidable. Sometimes you just have to deal with it. The opponent will be able to see 2 cards with his entire range. This is huge and often overlooked. When we check call with Jack of Spades, 10 of Spades on a Jack of Clubs, 7 of Hearts, 3 of Spades board, our opponent is guaranteed to get to see 2 cards. So, if we check here and our opponent bets, it's probably actually right here. We are never donking or check raising the turn here if the opponent bets the flop. This means our opponent is guaranteed to realize the full equity of his hand. See if another point on this. Think about what kind of runner-runner cards are possible. Very easy to think, my opponent only has a 10% chance to outdraw me on the turn. I'm going to go ahead and check call because I'm not really afraid of being outdrawn. But is his chance to outdraw you by the river 30%? So if we're check calling and our opponent is betting most of the time, he's going to get to see both the turn and the river. Because we're not going to be able to all of a sudden donk bet on the turn. And we're not going to really check raise the turn when we check called with a marginal strength hand. What turn card could come where after we check called the flop, with Jack 10 of Spades on a Jack of Clubs, 7 of Hearts, 3 of Spades board, what turn card could come where we would either donk bet or check raise? Probably none. A 10's not strong enough to check raise usually, because 8, 9 will have gotten there, and our opponent can still have sets of 7s and 3s. So we probably can't check raise Jack 10. Maybe we could, but probably not. We wouldn't really want to check raise a Jack, because we can easily be outkicked and we have bad removal effects for it. So when we check call Jack 10, we're not just saying, okay, well, how many outs does he usually have on the turn? It's how many times will he get there by the river? And now, since our opponent can bet the turn, he can randomize his bluffs well. If our opponent's betting the turn when the turn's a 4 of Hearts and he's good, he's probably randomizing it well. So he's probably betting the turn when he turned a flush draw or when he turned a straight draw plus weak pair. So he has sort of a combo draw. So he's going to be double barreling when he has a lot of, 10 out or more hands. So check calling can be quite bad in spots like this because we give our opponent 2 free cards. We don't give him just 1 card. Doesn't mean we can't check call. We're going to have to do it all the time. But realize you're giving your opponent usually 2 free cards. So even if he has a very slim chance to outdraw you on the turn, he can likely get there on the river. Note to future self, rant about pseudo-connectors in 3-bet and 4-bet pots pre-flop. Okay, so this is a concept that's very easy to illustrate pre-flop, and it's a spot a lot of people don't understand. So imagine you and I are playing against each other at the same table, and I'm on the button and you're in the big blind. I open the button to whatever, you make a normal 3-bet, and I 4-bet very, very small. I'm a huge advocate of 4-betting smaller than most people do, because I don't think most people like flatting 4-bets out of position, and I think most people won't develop a 5-betting range, and even if they do, a 5-betting range that can fold isn't all that useful. Sorry, when I say a 5-betting range, I mean a 5-betting range that isn't all in. So it makes my 4-bets very, very effective. Now, some people have a thought process which is very bad, which is if I 4-bet very small, so if, you 3-bet to 10 big blinds and I 4-bet you to, let's say, 18.5 big blinds, some people will think, wow, that 4-bet sizing sucks. Because now when I was 3-bet bluffing with a suited connector or a suited gapper, I'm just going to call the 4-bet because I'm getting a bunch of implied odds, and, even if my opponent has an overpair, I have like 20 or 25% equity, and I'm only risking 8 to win 30-some big blinds. And that's almost, 8 to win 30-some. 8 is like 25% of 38 as it is. Not to mention applied odds. That's their thought process, and it's wrong for a couple reasons. The first is, your suited connector might have 20 or 25% equity against my overpairs, But that's assuming you get to see the turn and the river. How likely are you to outdraw me on the flop? So if I 4-bet you, and you call, you might be like, oh cool, I flopped a flush draw, or oh cool, I flopped a gut shot, or I open-ended straight draw, but I'm not usually going to let you see the turn and the river. So even though you flopped a reasonably, high equity hand, you're not going to really be able to do anything with it profitably, because suited connectors need to see the turn and the river to outdraw me, and I'm not going to let those hands see the turn and the river extremely cheaply. I'm going to be able to look at the board texture and see what sizing I need to bet. So it's a good example of a spot where people think like, oh, my hand has this much equity, without realizing whether or not they're going to be able to get to realize all that equity. Here, it's the exact opposite effect. So when we check call on a Jack 7-3 board, we can't think to ourselves, how likely is our opponent to outdraw us on the turn? He's getting to realize all the equity because he's going to get to see both cards. Whereas if we're doing something like 4-betting super small pre-flop, how much, equity our opponent has, or how likely we are to be outdrawn by the river, is a much smaller deal. It doesn't really matter all that much because we're not going to let our opponents see the river very often. So understand the difference of that, and understand the difference between, overall equity and realizable equity, because that's going to make it much easier to make decisions. The perfect check calling hands. The perfect check calling hand has the following properties. Very high equity against the opponent's flop folding range. Making these hands fold with a bet accomplishes little. They're not going to outdraw us when they see the turn anyways. So we stress this a bunch, but if our bet doesn't make hands with a reasonable amount of equity fold, then there's really only one reason to be value betting, and that's to get value. We no longer are also making high equity hands fold. So check calling with hands that aren't afraid of those hands getting to see additional cards is usually a very good play. Has some equity against value hands in the opponent's betting range. So when the opponent bets, his range should be pretty polarized. It is good if our hand is a bluff catcher that has some outs to our opponent's value betting range. So that's hands in. That means our hand really, really wants to see a turn card. And the best way to ensure we get to see the turn card is to check with the intention of check calling, because if we bet, we might get raised off the hand. The hand is unable to value bet all the remaining streets, so that's simple enough. If we can get additional value, we can delay the bet and give our opponent a chance to bluff. So if we only can get 2 streets of value with our hand, and our hand doesn't need to make our opponent's, hands that would fold, because those hands don't have a lot of equity against our hand, we just check the flop and plan on betting the turn and the river, because that way we give our opponent a chance to bluff, and we protect some checks. Very strong hands when a check raise makes little sense, or we want to protect our check calling range. So pocket 7s on a 7-4-4 board when we cold called in the big line. So there's a lot of board textures where a check raising range just doesn't make sense. We want to check call with a lot of hands. Our range isn't strong enough to donk, and the few strong hands we have, we want to check call rather than check raise because our opponent's going to barrel so much. So those hands are also pretty much perfect check calling hands. So those are like the super nutted hands, which are much different than the other hands, which we're usually talking about with check calling, which is the mostly medium strength made hands. Examples: King 9 of diamonds on a King 2-2 board, Ace Jack on a Queen Jack 4 board, Ace Jack on a Jack 4-2 King board, and notice the Ace Jack has a flush draw in the last example, so when we check call, we're guaranteed to get a chance to pretty much realize our draw, and we might even just have the best hand when our opponent checks back, and we can consider value betting the river. But if we bet, maybe our opponent has King Jack and we'll get to make a big raise or something, and then, we won't be able to really play our draw that effectively as with respect to check calling. So this is pretty much what you're going to look for with the perfect check calling hand. And when we start solving the hands, if we see perfect check calling hands, we're just going to go ahead and throw them all down. And then once we have all the check calling, the check raising, and then the obvious bet hands thrown down, we'll deal with the rest. The effects of check raising. Check raising has many powerful effects. The opponent only sees the turn with about half of his betting range. Check raising is extremely expensive. If our opponent bets 6 BB into an 8 BB pot, we often check raise to like 16 or 18, so we're risking 16 or 18 to win 14 BBs, so our opponent can fold a ton. The opponent's folding range becomes incredibly strong because of this, and that's especially relevant to betting all 3 streets. So you want to compare how much does check raising make him felt compared to betting. The pot becomes much bigger, that's obvious. It reopens up the betting, which allows the opponent to 3-bet. That's also very key when we're out of position. If we bet and our opponent raises, we can end the betting. If we check and we call, we end the betting. If we check raise, our opponent gets a chance to put the 3rd bet in, which can be very bad. Since the opponent's flop bet is polarizing, our check raise range should be very polarized. If the opponent 3-bets, his range should be insanely polarized, so this should happen very rarely and only on very dry boards. So probably the biggest overall leak that people have is they don't understand how significant polarizing a range is a lot of the time. So that's why you'll see people raise too aggressively. They'll bet too aggressively because they just think it's easier to play by betting rather than checking or calling. And you really can see this a lot when it comes to check raising. Because if you do the theory for check raising out of position, a lot of times you should think, oh, my opponent will almost always call. But in reality, people tend to 3-bet a little bit too much because it's easier. So, example. Jack of hearts, 10 of hearts, 3 of clubs board, it makes sense to 3-bet the flop in position. It should still occur much more rarely than it probably does in practice, since 3-betting is easier than calling and playing poker. So, on a Jack 10-3 board that we just talked about, if someone bets in position, when they're in position, they probably can be betting a pretty wide range, because this is a good board texture where people don't want to give a ton of free cards. They might be betting a hand like Ace 10 or a weak Jack X for 2 streets of value because they want to charge for additional cards, and then they'll check back the river. So the opponent's flop bet when he's in position, even though his range is quite polarized, it's not as highly polarized as some other board textures. So, for example, on a King 7-2 rainbow board, if I'm betting the flop in position, a lot of times I won't bet like worse than King Queen there because I don't need to worry about going bet, bet, check. That's not a very common line. Here on the Jack 10-3 board, it's very common to bet 2 streets and then check the river. So the opponent's probably betting, more loosely for value, but it's still a polarized range. So once we check raise against that range, now since our opponent already had a polarized range, our check raising range should be very, very polarized. If we're check raising on this board, it's pretty much going to be 2-pair sets and awesome draws. So if we have a range of 2-pair sets and awesome draws, 3-betting is just not that effective for the opponent. Like, he really never makes us say, oh man, this is such a gross spot, because we were either check raising for value or we weren't. So when he 3-bets, it doesn't accomplish a whole lot, and it destroys his positional advantage. So it's not a line that should be taken as often in theory as it is in practice, because in practice, people just think, oh, I want to 3-bet a draw board because I don't know what to do on the turn. So a little bit of a rant there, but just know when we do check raising, people in practice are probably going to 3-bet more than they should in theory. The perfect value check raising hands. The perfect value check raising hands have the following properties. Are check raised on boards where giving a free card isn't very risky to the opponent's checking range. Note, if your check raise fails on a Jack 9 6 2-tone board, he probably isn't drawing to many strong draws on the turn, because if he had a strong draw, he would have just bet the flop and your check raise would have succeeded. Check raising Queen Queen is probably a bad idea here, because now a king or an ace can turn, and he would check back hands with an ace or a king probably, but check raising 9s is fine because they're not vulnerable to the overcard. So in addition to queens probably just being too weak to check raise once your check raise gets called, it's also important to think if your check raise fails with queens, your opponent is going to have more overcards that can outdraw you. A lot of times if I'm working with players and I see them say something like, oh, well, my opponent bets way too much, so I decided to check raise exploitatively, that's fine. But if you want to check raise queens exploitatively on a board like this, there's a lot of problems with it. So it would have to be like an amazing, amazing check raise target to make queens a good check raise on a board like this, rather than just a good one, in my opinion. So they are able to continue getting value on most turn and rivers against the opponent's very strong range. So once you check raise, you're not just, like a deer in headlights on the turn or river. And they occur on board textures where the opponent bets the flop with the intention of only getting 1 street of value. So, it's very easy for the opponent to value bet 1 or 2 streets with the marginal pairs if he can't be check raised, especially on an 8-7-2 rainbow or 6-6-3 type boards. Let me ninja edit real quick. The opponent will often check back the turn, so the check raise needs to happen now. So this is another thing that messed me up in theory for a long time. You get very used to saying, well, wait a second, why would I check raise now if I can slow play? Because usually the hands that want to raise are the hands that are sort of vulnerable yet strong. Those are almost always going to be the hands that make the most sense to raise. Whereas hands that are, super, super strong, like if you're in the button and you get 3-bet from the blinds and you have aces, you can slow play it in the button. Or if you flop quads or a set, you can slow play it. So I just thought to myself, like, why do I need to check raise 6x or pocket 3s on a 6-6-3 board? Well, the answer is because these are the board textures where if you don't, your opponent will bet a single street for value. So your check raise needs to happen now because he's not betting this super, super polarized range where he's going to, if he's betting the flop, he's planning on at least betting the turn. No, his range isn't that polarized where if he value bets the flop, he's guaranteed to bet the turn. He might just bet 1 street. So you have to check raise early on some board textures because if you don't, your opponent can bet any 2 cards and he'll check back the turn a bunch. And also, they do not have bad removal effects. So removal effects are pretty overrated pre-flop and even on the flop because there's just so many hand combinations. But when we're dealing with check raising and we're talking whether it's check raising for value or as a bluff, both players' felting range is going to be so strong by the river that if you're blocking, if you have top set, you're blocking a lot of relevant stuff there. So pay attention to removal effects. As recap of what we covered, we now understand enough about positional and out-of-position play to begin solving hands. While we cannot convert equity into expected value, which makes solving hands literally impossible, we now have enough information to try to make equilibrium points. Once we don't see how either player can change their strategy to make it more plus EV, we'll consider the hand as close to solved as we can get. I will give ratios and frequencies, all of which can be found in other videos as they're needed. It probably takes me between 45 minutes to 4 hours to solve a hand, depending on the level of detail I want to go into and the positions, and I've been doing this for a while. The methodology is most important, and for the sake of time, and since we'll still be learning new material, I'll pick simpler ranges. Small blind versus big blind is a lot harder than under the gun versus middle position. So, the methodology for this is going to be by far the most important, and just know when you do start doing this stuff for very complex ranges, this stuff can take a very, very, very long time the more detailed you want to get. And if you don't get very detailed, then you might ask yourself, like, well, is it really worth it? We're not actually now analyzing the stuff that was hard, because most people know what to do with the obvious hands. So, let's jump in. Okay, so a quick change of plans. I found out that under the gun versus middle position was probably too tight and not all that interesting. So instead we're going to do this range right here. This is what I'm considering the middle position opening range, and this is the button versus middle position flat. These are very, very close, if not exactly what I use. So this is what I would recommend using, and even if you have slightly different ranges that you use, they shouldn't be much different, and it's not a big deal. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to randomly generate a flop and hopefully talk about it a bit and get us on the right track. Then before I make the next video, I'm going to sit this out and start kind of trying to solve it. And then I can compare what I did to what you did. So if you make a mistake, you'll learn what you did wrong and remember it a lot better. Or you can see where we just have differing opinions. Because a lot of times it won't just be a clear mistake. We'll just have a different opinion. So let's go ahead and randomly generate that board now. Alright, so now we're going to randomly generate a board texture, and I'm not even going to lie to you. If it's a hard one, I'm just going to randomly generate another one. This one looks fine, though. So Queen 10-5 rainbow. So the first thing I want to do when I'm trying to figure out a hand is I want to sort of see how wide does the player in position need to call if the player out of position goes bet, bet, bet. Because the player out of position, when he starts by leading, no one's shown any weakness to him, so we kind of know that unless we think our opponent should be able to profitably bet out of position with a hand like pocket sixes or pocket fours here, which doesn't seem very good on this board texture, the player in position is going to need to defend. Player in position defends at least 60% times 60% times 60%. So it's around 60% on all three streets. It would be a little bit more on the flop because there's a little more implied odds and a little bit less on the river because there is no implied odds for, so there's no free roll effect. But it's around 60% on each street, which comes out to about 22 to 24%, when facing 75% pot size bets. So, if the player in position needs to defend between 20 to 24% against a bet, 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 what we want to do is see, okay, how wide does the positional range need to felt here? Well, since the positional range is going to get to bluff raise sometimes, and is going to get to improve on the turn in the river, it's extremely unlikely that we're going to have to even felt just all of our top pairs here. Because we already have 23% top pair in position here. Yet, if we add in the fact that we're going to just not want to call down all these hands, some hands we're going to want to bluff raise to balance out our value raises, and other hands are just going to get there on the turn or the river, we're not even going to really end up felting Queen Jack here. There's almost no turn and river combination where we're going to end up felting Queen Jack. So if we're only felting, 3 combos of King Queen suited, maybe, and we're not felting Queen Jack when our opponent goes bet, 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 it really doesn't make sense for the opponent to start value betting a hand here worse than Ace Queen with the intention of getting 3 streets of value. Being able to adjust your bet sizing is incredibly important for this, although we can't focus on that right now. But it's just extremely hard for the opponent to be able to go bet, 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 and the player in position call down with Queen King or worse. Think about that if you know that from your own experience. What turn and river combinations are you calling down with Queen Jack here? What turn and river combinations are you calling down with Queen King here if you face 3 bets from middle position? Probably very, very few, if any. Okay, so then now we kind of have, the obvious betting hand out of position is going to kind of lead from this. Is going to be like Ace Queen. That's kind of like the obvious betting hand. We maybe don't have to bet them all, but we probably are going to bet most or not all of them. King, that's the super obvious one, because King has no bad removal effects to Ace Queen, which the player in position is going to usually end up felting to 3 bets. And, Ace, even though it has not ideal removal effects, also is a fine bet, and so is a hand like Queen 10 suited. So those are sort of our out of position obvious betting hands, and we're just starting out with that rough estimate because we know how wide the opponent needs to felt. So the other thing I would recommend doing when you're doing this on your own is, first, decide how you are defending. I don't know why I'm capitalizing my words here. You are defending 60%, how you are defending 60% of the in-position range when facing a bet. So we have a good idea for what the person is going to bet out of position for value. How are we going to decide what's defending against a bet in position? Okay, so I've done this a ton in other videos, but let's think. First of all, what hands can we raise here? We would want to raise some hands like Queen 10 suited here, and probably some of our sets, but not all of our sets. So sure, let's go ahead and raise 5s, because even a hand like pocket 5s or Queen 10 suited, they're very vulnerable to hands like a king or an ace or a jack on the turn. If the turn card comes a jack, for example, the opponent has I think he has 20 straight combos, 9-8 and ace king. So if the turn comes a jack, he can have up to 20 straight combos. A king gives him up to, I guess, up to 22, and an ace gives a bunch of straight draws. Gets a bunch of straight draws there, but not as many as well. So just remember, it can make sense to raise 5s and Queen 10 suited here. They are pretty vulnerable to some turn cards. So we raise that, which is going to be 5 combos total. Bluff raise, maybe let's say 9 to 10. We'll get to that later. You can plug these in on your own if we don't get to it today. And then, so that alone gets us to 15 combos that are raising. And if we have a total of how many combos? We had a total of 128 combos. So right here, 128 times 0.6, we need to defend 77 combos total. So call is going to equal 77 minus 15. So we know that's going to equal 62 combos. So let's do that. That's ace queen. Sure, that gets us 12. King queen, that gets us 3. What else? We didn't even raise 10s, so 10s is 3 more. Cool. Queen jack suited, that gives us 4. King jack suited for the opening straight draw, jack 9 suited for another opening straight draw, that gives us 4, etc. So I'm not going to list them all out, but you can list the hands you need to call, and based on how many hands you need to call, you might find out, hey, I have to call with, maybe you're bluff raising 9-8, maybe you're bluff raising 7-6 of spades, maybe you're calling with it. Look to see how many hands you need to felt. The more you do this, the more comfortable you're going to get with sort of being able to immediately tell what you need to defend on the board. And I'm sorry if I just said felt. I obviously don't mean felt. I mean what you need to flat on a given board texture. Okay, so once we know how the player in position defends, even though we already started off by looking at sort of the obvious betting hand out of position because we wanted to start off seeing like what does our opponent usually need to felt, now that we have an idea for how our opponent defends, we can sort of see what hands make sense to bet out of position and what hands sort of make sense to check raise with out of position. So we have the obvious betting hands already written down, but we're also going to need to check raise some hands. So what hands should we check raise here? So this is for out of position. We should check raise, pocket 5s are fine. Pocket 10s are fine. We might not need to use all the combos, but these are pretty much going to be the hands that make sense to check raise, and probably not much else. And that makes sense, too, because if we check, we don't need to defend a huge portion of our checking range, right? Our opponent can bet any 2 cards profitably, but we don't want him betting any 2 cards because we want him to check back some hands, which are a higher plus EV as a check than a bet. So if we defend some of our checks by check calling and some by check raising, that's going to be fine. And if we did check raise all 6 combos here, keep in mind we'd be able to check raise an additional, depending on how much equity our bluffs have, 10 to 12 bluffs. So that gets us check raising quite aggressively. So let's see. Let's just estimate. Let's say our entire middle position range is 204 combos. If we bet this flop half the time, and then if we just check raise these sets and bluffs, that would get our check raising range to about 16 or 17%, which is very, very high. And that's with a flop C bet of 50%. So keep that in mind when you're trying to balance out all these ranges, that if you're only check raising sets, that's usually going to be correct. And you're not even probably going to always want to check raise all of your sets. A hand like queens, now that hand can be tricky here. Queens is a very tricky hand to play here because on one hand, queens are still vulnerable to a lot of straights in the opponent's range, but it's also hard to get value from betting a hand like pocket queens because we block all the queens in our opponent's range. So, maybe we could bet queens on the flop, hope he calls with a gut shot, and then check call or check raise the turn. That might make sense with pocket queens. Maybe we just want to start with check calling it on the flop so our range isn't capped. But even then, if we check call queens, our opponent will know he's pretty much nutted with ace queen, because if he has ace queen, we pretty much can't have queens. So queens is a much more, dynamic, interesting hand, and you're going to have to decide what you want to do with that when you're designing this range. So once you've sort of already played with the obvious hands, and it's very easy to defend in position, so you get an idea for how your opponent's defending in position, then you start figuring out what makes sense for out of position. This is the key step right here. Calculate how profitable a bet with any two cards is for your opponent in position. Use that number to see if your range looks reasonable. So, I don't know right now. Hopefully I'll have a better idea next week when the video starts, but I don't know right now how many sets we should be check raising here. Because I haven't looked at to see, okay, how much of an incentive am I giving my opponent to bet this flop when I check to him? How difficult is it for me to, check call as many hands as I need to? And if I find out, this is a board where I'm really having trouble check calling because my opponent can have a whole, a lot of gutters that maybe I can make fold on the turn if I bet twice, or maybe this board's not that hard to defend a lot of hands by check calling. That's going to really determine how many sets I check raise here. So I have an idea of where I'm going with the hand, but I don't know how I want to tweak this range until I've already sort of, seen like, okay, I'm doing the obvious stuff with the obvious hands. What do I need to do with my sets? Because my sets, in theory, can sort of easily check call, right? That protects our check calling range and it delays the raise to later on. That can make sense. Sets can easily bet, or sets can easily check raise here. They all make sense. So what I end up doing with all my pocket fives and pocket tens is largely going to depend on what my range needs. So I'm going to make the best guess that I can to start out, and I might find out something like, let's say I find out I'm c-betting, let's say 45% in defending, 45% of checks. How profitable is my opponent's air on the flop, and how profitable is it when my opponent bets his air after I check? So keep in mind that is two different things, because our opponent might flop air, but if he faces a bet, he just has to fold. Well, likewise, if our opponent flops air and we check, then he can make a profitable bet with that air, so his EV will be higher, obviously when he has a crap hand after we check than before he knows whether we're going to check or bet. So if I found out after my first guess I'm c-betting 45% and I'm defending 45% of my checks, I would run that number through and see sort of what numbers it gave me. And then if I found out like, oh, this really isn't giving my opponent a very big incentive to bet, then I'm probably going to check raise a little bit less and bet a little bit more aggressively because maybe my range is stronger than his. Or if I find out my opponent's going to bet like crazy, then I'm going to say, okay, now I need to make my betting range smaller and I need to check raise more aggressively here to, bring that profitability of my opponent's bet down. So I know this was a little scattered because I only had 10 or 15 minutes to do this, but it really will help you. And I'm not just saying this because we ain't going to do the whole hand. It really will help you if you work out through this the first time completely confused, rather than you see everything sort of all neatly and nicely presented like it will be in the next video. And we will talk about it a bunch once it's neatly and nicely presented, but you'll be able to compare what you have to what I have, because since some of this stuff is just, it's not like we're talking about polarized ranges on the turn where I could be like, no, the math shows this is right. If you disagree, you have to show me where the math is wrong. Math is very useful for ratios and stuff here for getting, started with frequencies, but there's no way to solve for this kind of stuff. So if you disagree with me here, I might not very, we might not very passionately disagree with each other. You might be check raising, 3 set combos and I'm check raising 5. Neither one of us knows if we're right. So run through this the first time on your own. It will take a long time, but you'll learn a lot and you'll learn how difficult it is the first time you do it. And this isn't even really particularly hard texture with very hard ranges. And then after you do it, we'll talk about it next week. You can post in the forums what you did and we can all talk about that. So that will be a good thing. But yeah, spend some time with this if you really want to get the most out of the next video, and I'll show you what I came up with. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it had a lot of content that was kind of everywhere, but hopefully within the next few videos, especially as we start doing more Flopzilla oriented stuff, you'll see how it all comes together and ranges start making pretty complex equilibriums. So thanks for watching everyone. Good luck at the tables and I'll see you soon.